All right, guys, to get started on this project, I want you to go ahead and take that watercolor paper and set it up to look just like my handout here. So give it the title, make sure you have a spot for your name, and then you need all these boxes that you see on here with the different techniques I've listed. Go ahead and pause the video and make sure you get all these things on your paper using a Sharpie or a pencil so that it doesn't bleed when you put the watercolor on. I don't mind if you guys do it in a different order or arrange it differently on the paper. Just make sure you have every part of this on here, including the circle, because you're going to paint this to be a sphere. Now, the first part that I want to see you guys work on is the value scale. So you're trying to give me 4 different values using watercolor, and that is all about how much water you mix with your paint. So going over to our paint tray here, I'm going to go ahead and get some water on my brush, choose one color only. I'm going to go ahead and choose the blue color. I'm putting a lot of water in there to sort of wake up that paint. And then I'm going to take it, I'm going to put it in the tray, that lid part of the watercolor set. If this was all muddy, like you can see some of mine is with other colors, take a wet paper towel and just wipe it out so you don't end up with muddy colors as you work. I keep dipping my brush and adding some water to this because of what I want to see you guys do is come up with 4 different values. So I think I've got enough water in here. I'm going to go ahead and try it. That's a little dark. I'm going to take a paper towel and just blot that right back out. I need that to be the lightest value I can get. So adding more water to my tray over here. And then I'm going to go ahead really lightly, just carefully paint that in there. So I've got the lightest blue I think I can make. Go ahead and dip a little more color on your brush and add it to that puddle of water. It's handy if you keep scratch paper nearby so that you can test this, because I'm going to just go ahead and test on the paper and hope for the best here. I think that's okay. So it's a little bit of a darker blue. And all this is changing only because of how much water to paint ratio I have. I need to make a darker one still. I'm going to get a little more paint on the brush, dip it in here. This one can be pretty dark. Let's check it. It looks good. So I've got 3 different ones so far. Paint it in there. I do expect you guys to stay inside the lines. Whoops, like I just didn't. That's part of learning to control your paint. To be fair, I'm holding a camera while I do this, just saying. For my last value here, I'm actually going to dip right in the paint well, and I'm not even going to go back to that puddle of water. Let's see how dark I can get this blue. That's really dark. We're going to do a project with this later where you paint a landscape using only the one color, and you need to be able to show me different values in order for that landscape to work. Okay, get your 4 values done. Pause the video if you need to, and then we'll pick it up again in a second. Once you finish that value scale, I want you to go to this one. It's called a gradation. We're trying to change from a dark color to a really light color smoothly, kind of like when you've done a blended value scale before using a pencil or color pencil. So I'm going to start with a lot of color on my brush here. Very carefully paint that into the top of my box. I want more color than that. I want it to be obvious. Okay, look how that color just bleeds with the water there. Okay, I'm going to move that down a little bit on the paper with my brush, and now I'm going to go back to my water well. I'm just going to get some pure water and see if I can pull this, get that to fade a little bit. Keep blending it down. Now that got a little bit wet on me. It's always okay to grab your paper towel, dry that off. Okay, try this again. See if I can get this to fade perfectly to the lightest blue I can possibly make. And again, trying to stay inside the box. Smooth it out a little bit. I'm not looking for perfection, but I am looking to see that you can go from something darker to something lighter. Okay, not bad. Moving on to the next box. Now you're choosing 2 colors and you're trying to blend them together. Since I'm on a blue kick, I'm going to go ahead and stick with my blue here at the top of the paper. Pick a color that is similar. I would prefer you don't pick orange, right? Because that's the opposite. If I try to blend orange into this right now, what I'm going to end up with is mud. Not that that's totally bad, but that's not really what I'm working on. I'm going to go with yellow. Blue and yellow make green. So working from the bottom. The key here is keeping these colors wet. So I'm blending my colors right on the paper, and I should get something greenish since I'm mixing 2 colors together. Blue and yellow make green. And that's all you're doing, kind of working back and forth, making sure that paint stays wet, get a little streaky there. I'm going to rinse my brush and blot it. Try one more time to keep that looking kind of smooth. Okay. The next box here on our chart is called salt. This one's super fun, but it has to be done quickly. The salt, just regular old table salt, is sitting at the front of the classroom. It should be sitting with the watercolor sets. Take just a pinch. You can put it in your hand, or if you have a cup handy, you can pour just a teeny bit in a cup. I am without either. I'm going to pour mine on the table. Start by getting a ton of color on the paper. Again, I'm doing my blue here. I might add some purple too to keep this interesting. Want to make sure it's real obvious for you. Adding some purple right to this. The heavier color makes this more obvious. Do it while it's wet. So I'm ditching that paintbrush and I'm going to go ahead and drop my salt right on that paint as quickly as possible. Don't be shy. What happens here is the salt actually starts to absorb some of that color. Salt likes to mess with moisture. So as I set it on there, you'll see once it dries that it makes a little bit of a sunburst or a little starburst. So you can see how that salt is sort of sucking up some of that paint right there. We're just going to let that sit there and we'll come back to it later and brush that salt off and you'll see the texture that it creates. The next technique on my chart is doing a wet on wet. Wet on wet means starting with wet paper. So just using plain water on my brush, getting this nice and saturated, almost like a puddle. And then I'm going to dip into my color and I'm just going to touch the paper and watch how that bleeds. Makes beautiful texture, makes really fun patterns and designs. You can see how it's pushing the water around. You can do this with color already on the paper. You can do it with multiple colors. Okay, there's lots of ways you can play with this, but part of it is having enough water on the paper so that when you add that really heavy pigment, it does some interesting push against the water. If your water is still wet enough, you can take that and start to tilt the paper. Tilt it in different directions and watch it start to bleed. Okay, go ahead and pause the video because you kind of need both hands for this technique. Use at least 2 colors, maybe 3. Mess around with it and see what you can come up with. Forgot to have you guys do your sphere, but since we've just practiced a wet on wet, I'm going to go ahead and do my sphere with the wet on wet technique a little bit. So I've got the paper wet. I'm going to go ahead and take my blue again, dip it right into that paint container. I'm going to start with the dark side. Pretend like my light is coming from the left. And I'm going to start blending out from that darker edge into something a little bit lighter. I want to see you make me a 3-dimensional sphere, and that means messing with darker to lighter values with the pigment in your paint. The wet helps you keep blending. Don't get streaky, don't get too heavy in one area. It keeps it bleeding so it feels soft, and it makes that sphere feel round. Added a little bit of just plain water here to sort of soften where I felt like it was getting too strong. And don't forget, I always require and expect a cast shadow. So if the light's coming from the left, our shadow is to the right. Give yourself a nice dark saturated pigment to create some kind of cast shadow effect down here on the paper. I want it to be even darker. I'm going to add more pure blue. And since it's wet already, it's just kind of bleeding right into that I already started. Okay. I used my same color. I used blue here and I used only blue here to make my 3D sphere. For the Crayon Resist technique here, you're going to go find a white Crayola crayon at the front of the classroom. This is a twistable because I'm at home and it's my kids, but you'll find plain white crayons with our watercolor supplies. Go ahead and just draw some kind of nice design in there, whatever floats your boat, I don't care. I want you to see how this can resist the watercolor. This can come in handy if there's parts of a painting that you want to be sure to leave white. Maybe stars in a night sky, maybe some clouds in the sky during the daytime. So with some wet watercolor, I'm going to paint right over this. Unfortunately, my kids' crayons are not the best. It's not really working. I'm going to add some water to this to see if I can sort of lift off. I can even use a paper towel. And you see when I use that paper towel, it didn't quite saturate into the waxed areas. So I did manage to save this Crayon Resist. If it's not working for you right away, like it wasn't working for me, go ahead and try that. I'm going to have to do it again because I know that stupid twistable is not as good as a regular crayon, like the ones I have provided for you at the front of the classroom. So I'm just going to blot a little bit with my towel here so I can sort of save that design and that texture, and I promise you this works a little bit better when you don't use a cruddy crayon from home. This next technique is a little bit more advanced. It's a combination of two techniques. I have not introduced to you dry brushing, but I think you'll understand. I'm going to squeeze off any of that moisture that I had on my brush. And going to my paint well here, since my blue is already wet, I'm going to start with that one. I want you to give me some texture up here at the top. Let's pretend this was some winter trees, maybe in the forest. And at the top, we can see these textured leaves of the trees. So I'm adding lots of that texture with just a lot of paint and hardly any water. Notice how it's not moving. It's just staying right where I put it like regular paint would. But as I come down here, I'm going to start picking up a little watery paint from my palette. I'm going to add that in here. And notice how the paint texture is moving more now. So continue kind of blotting at it and wiggling my brush around. And as I come down here, I'm going to go ahead and actually just add some water and start to pull that. What we've done is created sort of a misty effect. If you were painting something like the woods in the wintertime and it was a foggy day, you're moving from a dry brush texture and slowly working into a wash down here. Go ahead and try that. It's an interesting technique to use sometimes when you're doing a landscape painting. Next up down here, I'm going to try doing what's called lifting. You can lift with a very dry paintbrush. You can also lift paint with a paper towel. This comes in handy for doing clouds. So I'm going to go ahead and get some nice wet blue paint on there. I'm going to make it fairly saturated pigment to be sure that you guys can kind of see what's going to happen here. All we're doing is blotting with the paper towel. So I started with a wash, making sure that it was kind of heavy. And then I'm taking a paper towel and I'm going to dab to lift out some of that pigment. This can make some really cool little cloud effects. So go ahead and dab at it to create that texture. You need to dab pretty hard. You can't do this wimpy or it won't do much. Go ahead and play around with that. You can even, if you didn't like your first effort, I could paint this again and try again. Our last technique today is to do a little bit of what's called glazing. You're kind of making a plaid for me. You know what plaid is? Colors that overlap each other. Pick some colors. I want different colored stripes laid on the paper. So I'm starting with my up-down stripes. Pick whatever your favorite colors are. Go a little heavy with the pigment so we can see the colors and how they're going to mix when we do this thing called glazing. I'll go with purple. Then you're going to have to take a break and let this dry, because if I went and painted right away with my next layer of colors, what's going to happen? It's all going to bleed together. So take a moment, pause the video, blow on your paper until you get that thing to be dry. All right, I'm back. I blew on it for a minute. If you're anything like me, you're a little bit impatient. I'm going to go for it and hope that my paper has dried enough. Glazing is overlapping colors and letting some of the pigment from the previous color show through. So I'm taking a new color here. I've grabbed yellow and I'm just painting a stripe across it. I want you to observe how the blue color still shows through on watercolor. That is where watercolor is unique from acrylic paint or tempera paint that we typically use in this classroom. I'm grabbing a different color. I'm going to go with red. Try another color going across. And play with it. Try going a little heavier and see if you still see those colors shining through and kind of what effects you get from it. So this technique is called glazing. Now you may have thought we were done, but we are not. I forgot there was one more technique I want you to do. I'm going to go ahead and draw myself one more rectangle on here. This box is going to be for adding rubbing alcohol. Rubbing alcohol is a ton of fun. I personally don't find a lot of use for it when I'm doing something realistic, but it makes this awesome effect. And I've already messed up because you know what's really important? That you get the rubbing alcohol. Go to the front of the classroom and you'll see a bottle of basic rubbing alcohol. You need to pour that into a tiny cup. So we have the yogurt cup sitting over at the sink in the drain rack. You only need like Just the tiniest bit. So you guys see how little I poured in there? I mean, really looking at this close, I've probably got, can you see that? It's almost nothing. Set that somewhere convenient. Go ahead and get heavy, wet pigment on the paper. This does not work the second the paint dries. It is no longer going to do anything. I don't know why I'm so fond of blue and purple today, but I am. So I have really heavy, wet pigment. I'm going to clean off my brush because, I don't know, it doesn't seem like it makes sense to put a mucky brush in the rubbing alcohol. I dipped it into the alcohol. Let's hope it works. Take a look at that effect up close. When I dip my brush onto that wet paper, it actually pushes the alcohol away. Let me pull back here a little bit so it can focus. Add some interesting dots and textures. This is just a really fun way to play around with watercolor. Looks like I need more. You can see why we don't need much. All right, go ahead and finish that up. That was it for this particular lesson. I want this sheet turned into me. Make sure your name is at the top and you've completed all the sections, and then you'll get your next watercolor assignment.